Picture this. You're driving down the Trans-Canada Highway somewhere between Winnipeg and Thunder Bay. It's -22 outside. Your fuel gauge is creeping toward empty. And right there, on the side of the highway, you see it. A gas station with diesel prices sitting 40 cents below everything you've seen in the last 3 hours. Instinct takes over. You signal right. You start to slow down. That's what any normal person would do. Now picture a Canadian long-haul trucker in that exact same situation. Same highway, same brutal cold, same nearly empty tank, same cheap fuel sign flashing in the dark. He doesn't even lift his foot off the gas. He blows right past it, doesn't even glance at the sign. And here's what makes that moment truly strange. This driver operates under some of the most brutal cost pressure in any industry in this country. Fuel is his single biggest expense. His dispatcher tracks every dollar. His company survives on razor-thin margins. And yet, he just drove past 40-cent cheaper diesel without flinching. That's not a mistake. That's not stubbornness. And it's definitely not stupidity. What you just witnessed is the output of a calculation so complex it runs silently on every major highway across Canada, and almost nobody outside the trucking industry knows it exists. That's exactly what we're breaking down today. The first answer most people reach for is simple. Canadian truck drivers hunt for cheap diesel. And honestly, that part isn't wrong. Diesel prices across provincial lines can swing by 60, 70, sometimes over $1 per liter within a few hundred kilometers of each other. A single long-haul truck burns roughly 5,000 liters of diesel per month. At a 60-cent difference per liter, that's $3,000 per truck per month. Run a fleet of 500 trucks and you now have an entire department whose only job is to buy fuel more efficiently. So price matters enormously. But here's the thing. The price on the sign has almost nothing to do with the actual cost of fuel. If cheap fuel simply meant cheap total cost, every budget station in Ontario would be packed wall to wall with rigs. But they're not. Dispatchers regularly direct drivers to pass lower-priced stations and stop at more expensive ones. Every single day, on every major corridor in this country. The reason comes down to a system called the International Fuel Tax Agreement, known in the industry as IFTA. For your personal car, fuel tax is simple. You fill up in Ontario, you pay Ontario's fuel tax, and that money stays in Ontario. Transaction done. A commercial truck doesn't work that way. A Canadian long-haul driver might start his week in Vancouver, cross into Washington State, loop through Montana, re-enter Canada at Alberta, deliver in Saskatchewan, then head home through Manitoba. 5 or 6 different tax jurisdictions in a single trip, and each of them wants a cut based on how many kilometers the truck actually drove on their roads, not on where he bought the fuel. IFTA is the system that settles that debt every quarter. Here's where it gets interesting. Ontario charges over 14 cents per liter in provincial fuel tax. Alberta charges under 9. That gap doesn't sound like much until you multiply it across 5,000 liters a month, across hundreds of trucks, across an entire year. So if your driver buys cheap diesel in Manitoba, but burns most of it driving through Ontario, your company owes the tax difference at quarter end. That cheap fill-up wasn't cheap at all. You just deferred the cost by 90 days. Conversely, load up on expensive fuel in a high-tax province, burn most of it crossing a low-tax jurisdiction, and IFTA sends you a credit. The expensive fill-up actually saved you money. This is why modern fleet management software calculates the true net cost per liter in real time, factoring pump price, tax differential, and the full planned route simultaneously. The software tells the driver exactly which station to stop at. Many carriers lock the fuel cards so the driver physically cannot pay anywhere else. If the card gets declined, the driver keeps moving. The price you see at the pump is a facade. The real price is calculated in a server room, running continuously, for every truck on every highway in Canada. The physics problem, nobody talks about. Even if you build a perfect tax optimization system, there's still a wall you cannot negotiate with. It's not a policy. It's not a software limitation. It's physics. Think of a Canadian long-haul truck as a professional fighter on the morning of a title bout, standing on the scale, knowing that 1 kilogram over means the fight doesn't happen. In Canada, a standard tractor-trailer is legally limited to a maximum of 63,500 kilograms on most interprovincial highways. When hauling a full load, you're often right at that ceiling. Every kilogram matters. Here's the problem. Diesel fuel is not light. A single liter weighs roughly 0.85 kilograms. A full tank across 2 tanks holds anywhere from 500 to 1,000 liters, meaning a complete fill-up can add between 425 and 850 kilograms to the total vehicle weight. If the cargo is already near the legal limit, A full tank of diesel doesn't just cost money. It makes the truck illegal the moment it pulls onto a provincial highway. Canada takes this seriously. Weigh scales sit on every major freight corridor, on the 401 in Ontario, on the Trans-Canada through British Columbia, deployed unpredictably by provincial highway traffic officers across the prairies. An overweight conviction goes directly onto the carrier's CVOR, the Commercial Vehicle Operator's registration. A bad CVOR score can cost a carrier their operating license, their entire business. So the driver isn't just making a fuel cost calculation. He's making a fuel cost calculation and a weight calculation simultaneously. If the cargo is heavy, he might only be authorized to take on 200 liters instead of 600. Stopping at the cheap station 50 kilometers back would have only allowed a small top-up anyway. It made more sense to keep moving to the next approved stop where the weight allows a full fill and the IFTA math works out. And then there's the scenario that sounds completely insane, but happens on Canadian roads more often than anyone admits. If a driver misjudges and takes on too much fuel, pushing him over the legal weight limit, he cannot legally proceed. His only option is to idle the truck and literally burn fuel until the tank drops enough to bring him back under the ceiling. Just like a fighter sitting in a sauna the night before weigh-ins, burning off every last gram, the driver burns the fuel he just paid for to get light enough to move legally. It sounds absurd, but it still costs less than an overweight fine, a CVOR mark, and a delayed delivery. The balancing act. Weight limits in Canada get even more specific than most people realize, and this is the layer that genuinely shocks people when they first hear it. It's not enough to be under the total gross vehicle weight. The weight has to be distributed correctly across each individual axle group. Here's the image that makes this click. Picture yourself carrying 2 heavy grocery bags hanging from a wooden pole across your shoulders. Both bags weigh the same. You walk fine. But if someone quietly doubles the weight of the left bag without touching the right one, even if the total weight is still within what you can carry, your left shoulder takes a beating it was never designed to handle. A Canadian long-haul truck works exactly the same way. Most rigs carry 2 fuel tanks, one on the driver's side, one on the passenger's side. Transport Canada and provincial regulations set limits not just for the total vehicle weight, but for the steer axle, the drive axles, and the trailer axles independently. If a faulty pump or calibration error causes one tank to fill faster than the other, the truck becomes laterally unbalanced. The heavier side pushes down harder on the wheels beneath it. Even if the total gross weight is legal, that one overloaded side can push the axle group measurement over the provincial threshold. When the truck rolls onto a weigh station platform, the system measures each axle independently. The alarm doesn't care that the other side is fine. It only knows one number is wrong. Fine issued, CVOR marked, delivery delayed, all because of one lopsided fill. This is why experienced Canadian drivers and fleet managers pay close attention not just to how much fuel goes in, but to where it ends up across both tanks. And why fuel stops are timed and sequenced to maintain lateral balance across thousands of kilometers of Canadian highway. Before the system existed, the optimization running Canadian trucking today feels almost inevitable. But there was a time when none of it existed, and understanding that makes everything you just learned feel even more remarkable. Before January 1st, 1996, there was no IFTA. Picture a dispatcher in Toronto in 1994. Trucks rolling through Ontario, Quebec, Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois simultaneously. Each American state has a different fuel tax form, a different deadline, a different penalty for errors. His drivers are calling in from weigh stations and state borders, each one waiting on paperwork that has to be filed separately, to the right office, in the right state, in the right format. Some American states required carriers to purchase a minimum volume of fuel within their borders as proof of tax compliance, regardless of whether the economics made any sense. Others required trucks to stop at the state line and buy a temporary operating permit before crossing. For Canadian carriers moving freight across the border, which is the majority of Canadian long-haul freight, this was a bureaucratic disaster on every single trip. Dispatch teams spent more hours on interjurisdictional paperwork than on routing freight or managing driver hours. IFTA collapsed all of that into a single quarterly report, filed with the carrier's home province. The province handled all the interjurisdictional settlement on the carrier's behalf. The mandatory compliance stop disappeared overnight, and in its place, the algorithmically optimized fuel stop emerged. What started as spreadsheet calculations became integrated telematics systems that today factor in fuel price, tax jurisdiction, cargo weight, axle distribution, driver hours of service, and approved fuel card locations, updating every few minutes across thousands of kilometers of highway. The chaos of dozens of separate systems became the precision of one, what you actually saw. So let's go back to that moment on the Trans-Canada. The truck that blew past the cheap diesel station outside Winnipeg wasn't making a mistake. The driver wasn't being careless with his company's money. He was executing a calculation that weighed the IFTA tax differential across his next 3 jurisdictions, the cargo weight against his 63,500 kilogram ceiling, the lateral balance across both fuel tanks, the approved stations locked into his fuel card, and the true net cost per liter after every adjustment, all at once, all in real time. The sign said, cheap. The system said, keep moving. And the system was right. Every fuel stop on every Canadian highway, from the 401 corridor in Ontario to the Coquihalla in BC to the Canamex route running south through Alberta into the United States, is the output of that silent calculation, invisible to everyone except the driver and the dispatcher watching the telematic screen hundreds of kilometers away. The next time you see a rig accelerate past a budget fuel station, you're not watching someone make a bad decision. You're watching 30 years of regulatory evolution, real-time data optimization, and physics-driven logistics play out in a single split second at highway speed. And now you know exactly how that calculation works. Here's a question for the Canadian drivers and dispatchers watching this. Has the system ever told you to do something that made 0 sense when you were actually out on the road? The wait call that didn't add up, the fuel stop that seemed completely backwards, the scale decision that cost you hours. Drop it in the comments. I want to hear the real stories from people who live this every day on Canadian roads. And if this is the kind of content you want, the hidden systems quietly running the industries you pass on the highway every single day, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this coming. See you next time.